They laughed when Jack Turner, a broken Army engineer, said he'd rebuild his father's burned-down greenhouse. But when his loyal German shepherd started digging beneath the soil and gold coins began to gleam under the dirt, the town stopped laughing. What he unearthed would expose a secret buried since 1945. Like and subscribe if you want to see how one soldier turned ashes into honor. The train groaned into Flathead County like an old man coughing through his last breath. Its metal bones hissed as it stopped beside a platform where time seemed to have given up. Jack Turner stepped down one boot, then the other, heavy against the wood. He wore the kind of expression that told you he'd seen things he didn't want to remember and couldn't forget even if he tried. The air smelled like pine and iron, and under it all that faint tang of smoke he thought he'd left behind years ago. He adjusted the strap of his worn duffel from Kandahar. The town hadn't changed much. Same shuttered diner, same half-lit gas station, same billboard promising Montana's freshest apples peeling under the wind. He looked past the empty road toward a hill in the distance. Somewhere up there, past the broken fence line and the rows of dead trees, stood what was left of his father's greenhouse. His inheritance. His burden. His last unfinished conversation with a man who'd burned with it. A bark broke the silence. He had asked Pete Garrison to keep his father's old pickup running. The keys and the registration sat waiting at the depot clerk's desk since yesterday. Scout, his German shepherd, leapt from the truck bed behind the station landing with the confidence of an old soldier. Golden black fur gleamed in the dying light muscles rippling beneath. Jack had rescued him overseas technically, but in truth it was the dog who'd saved Jack more times than he could count. "Still got more life in you than I do," Jack muttered. Scout tilted his head as if disagreeing. The drive to the property took half an hour, the road winding through empty fields and frost-bitten fence posts. The sun dipped low, staining the clouds in copper and blood. When Jack finally turned into the dirt path leading home, the truck shuddered like it was protesting the idea. The gate leaned on one hinge, the letters Turner Greenhouse barely legible on the rusted arch. He killed the engine. The world went still. The air here was different, thicker somehow, as if memory had weight. He walked up the path, Scout pacing beside him, tail low but alert. The greenhouse stood at the far end of the orchard, or what used to be one. Rows of skeletal apple trees stretched like gravestones, branches brittle and gray. The greenhouse was a ghost glass shattered steel bent. Jack stared at it for a long moment, something hollow stirring in his chest. This was where his father had died nearly 30 years ago. The fire had started at midnight, spread too fast, devoured everything. The report had called it faulty heating equipment. But Jack remembered the smell differently. Not electrical, chemical. He had been 18 then, packing for basic training when the sirens wailed. By the time he'd reached the orchard, it was over. Just embers and a shape covered by a tarp. The town said it was an accident, but Jack had never believed in coincidences that big. Scout's growl snapped him back. The dog stood rigid, nose pointed at the far corner of the foundation, where the ash met fresh concrete. Jack followed the gaze, crouched and brushed his hand across the ground. The concrete there was lighter, newer, someone had patched it. "Easy, boy," Jack murmured, though his voice trembled. He stood scanning the rest of the site. Everything about it felt wrong. Too clean in some places, too untouched in others. He walked inside the greenhouse, stepping over bent rebar and piles of broken glass. The smell of char still lingered. He ran a hand across a half-melted steel beam and froze. And there, stamped faintly into the metal, were words barely visible under soot, "Property of U.S. Army." He stepped back, heart-thudding. His father had been a farmer, not military. There was no reason that kind of steel should have been here. Scout whined low, brushing against his leg. "Yeah," Jack whispered, "I see it too." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose glass like a whisper of warning. He turned toward the truck, but before he could take a step, he noticed something else. An outline burned into the ground. Not just blackened earth, but circular, like a seal. Whatever had burned here, it hadn't been random. He knelt, pressed his palm against the dirt. Cold, solid. Too solid for 20 years of Montana frost. You're seeing ghosts, Turner, he muttered. But the tremor in his hand betrayed the lie. Scout barked once, sharp, echoing across the orchard, bouncing off the broken beams. Jack looked up at the horizon where dusk was swallowing the light, and for the first time since stepping off that train he felt something he hadn't felt in years, purpose. Broken. Dangerous but alive. "All right," he said, brushing ash from his jeans. "Let's rebuild this damn thing." Scout wagged his tail once, like he approved of the mission, and together they stood in the fading light, two survivors staring at a ruin that refused to die. Morning came cold and thin, a pale light bleeding through the cracked panes of the kitchen window. Jack poured coffee into a chipped mug, the kind that still carried faint soot from years of neglect. Scout lay by the door half asleep, but alert ears twitching with every creak. Outside, frost clung to the weeds, turning the orchard into a field of glass. Jack looked out across it, that sense of unease from last night still settling in his chest. He could almost hear the echo of the fire that had taken everything. The knock came just as he reached for his jacket, 3 slow, deliberate taps that didn't sound like a neighbor. When he opened the door, Ray Hollis stood there smiling in a way that didn't reach his eyes. Time had filled him out, silvered his hair, and wrapped him in the kind of authority that came with staying in one place too long. Jack Turner Hollis said warmly, extending a hand, "You look just like your father." Jack hesitated before taking it. "I'm surprised you remember," Hollis chuckled. "How could I forget Grant was one of the best men I ever knew. Hard-headed, sure, but loyal. We all took the fire pretty hard." His eyes flicked toward the field, lingering. "Place still smells of it." Jack crossed his arms. "Yeah, I'm rebuilding the greenhouse. Figured it's time this land grew something again." Hollis nodded slowly. "I admire that, but I'll be honest with you, Jack. This property's sitting on prime soil. Apex Urban Development's been eyeing this stretch for months. They're building eco-lodges down the valley. Could make you a fair offer." "More than fair, actually." "I'm not selling," Jack said quietly. Hollis's smile stiffened. "You should at least think about it. No one expects you to live out here alone. You've done your service. You've earned peace." Jack's jaw tightened. This was my father's land. It stays that way. For a second, Hollis's eyes hardened, something cold flickering behind the politician's charm. Then it was gone, replaced by practiced warmth. "Of course," he said, stepping back. "But take my advice, some things are better left as memories." He tipped his hat and walked toward his black SUV, gravel crunching under polished shoes. Scout growled low until the car disappeared around the bend. Jack looked down at him. "Didn't like him either, huh?" The dog only stared at the road, ears still pinned back. By evening, Jack had started clearing out more of the greenhouse. Every sound felt amplified, the wind, the shovel, the creak of metal. He stopped to catch his breath, wiping sweat from his neck despite the chill. Scout was pacing, restless, his nose twitching. "What is it, boy?" Jack asked, but the answer came not in a bark but in silence, an alert stillness that made the hair on Jack's arms rise. Then the smell hit him. Gasoline. A flicker of orange light reflected off the shards of glass near the door. The next second, a bottle crashed against the gate, flames erupting in a small, violent bloom. Scout Jack yelled. The dog lunged toward the fire, dragging a wet tarp from a pile of junk, pawing it over the gate, smothering the flames in a hiss of smoke and steam. Jack grabbed the water hose and doused the last of it, coughing. The air filled with the bitter tang of burnt fuel. He looked around, but whoever had thrown it was already gone. Only tire marks curved away toward the road. "Someone wants us gone," he muttered, rubbing soot from Scout's fur. The dog's chest heaved, eyes sharp, scanning the dark edges of the orchard. Jack led him inside, locked the doors, and sat by the window for a long while, listening. The wind had picked up again, brushing against the cracked glass like a warning. He tried to sleep, but every sound felt wrong, the gate, the branches, maybe footsteps. When dawn finally bled through, he stepped out onto the porch. Frost glimmered on the boards, the air sharp enough to sting. Something was tucked under the front door. A manila envelope, plain sealed, no name. Jack frowned, tore it open. Inside were 4 glossy photographs. Grainy, but clear enough to see himself and Scout digging near the eastern wall of the greenhouse 2 days earlier. The angle was high-distant, taken through a zoom lens. On the last photo, bold black letters had been typed across the bottom margin, "Stop digging the past." Jack felt the blood drain from his face. He looked toward the orchard, the frost-covered trees standing still as witnesses. Someone had been watching them. Maybe last night. Maybe all along. Scout's ears went up a growl, rumbling low in his throat as he turned toward the far ridge where the woods thickened. Jack followed his gaze, but saw only mist curling through the branches. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Jack clenched the photos in his fist, eyes narrowing toward the horizon. "All right," he whispered more to himself than anyone. "Now we're digging for real." The photographs lay spread across the kitchen table, their glossy surfaces catching the morning light like mirrors reflecting suspicion. Jack stared at them until the coffee in his mug went cold. Scout sat by the door, restless, glancing toward the orchard every few seconds as if waiting for something to move. The message in bold black letters echoed in Jack's mind. "Stop digging the past." That single line did more than threaten, it confirmed what he already felt in his gut. Someone was afraid of what he might find. He looked out through the cracked window toward the greenhouse. The ground out there held secrets, and for the first time, he was certain his father had been part of something far bigger than anyone had ever said. Jack went to the shed and rummaged through his old gear from the cores. Beneath a pile of tools and dust lay a piece of his past metal detector, battered and scratched, but still functional. He ran his hand along the handle, remembering its sound when it caught history buried in dirt. "Let's see what you remember," he murmured, slinging it over his shoulder. The day was cold enough to sting. He stepped into the greenhouse, the air thick with dust and silence. Scout padded beside him, nose low, tail stiff. Jack switched on the detector. The steady hum filled the space, followed by the rhythmic sweep of its circular head moving over the ground. For several minutes, nothing, just the sound of wind sneaking through broken glass. Then, as he passed the eastern wall, the machine gave a sharp, sustained beep. Jack froze, eyes narrowing. "You hear that, boy?" he whispered. Scout's ears perked up. The detector wailed louder, the signal pulsing like a heartbeat. Jack set it down, crouched, and marked the spot with a piece of chalk. "Half a meter deep," he said more to himself. Scout began pawing at the ground, digging with the urgency of instinct. Dust rose in clouds around his paws. Jack joined in with the shovel, cutting through layers of dry soil until metal scraped against metal. He stopped, brushed the dirt aside, revealing the dull curve of something long and rusted. It wasn't a pipe, not quite. The edges were too deliberate, the metal thicker than plumbing. He cleared more of the soil until an entire length of cylindrical steel lay exposed, nearly 2 meters long, capped at both ends, seams welded shut. The surface bore faint markings, eaten away by rust. "What the hell is this doing here?" he muttered, glancing at Scout, who barked once, sharp and insistent, as if to say, "Keep going." Jack retrieved his toolbox, pried open one of the weld seams with a chisel and mallet, the metal groaning with protest. Inside, the smell hit him first, a mixture of oil age and something faintly burnt. He reached in, carefully pulling out a bundle wrapped in waxed canvas. The material cracked under his touch. He unrolled it on a clean patch of ground, revealing what looked like official papers. Edges, singed ink, faded but legible. The top page bore a military seal, U.S. Army Pacific Transfer Vault, S7, 1945. His pulse quickened. He turned the page. Beneath the heading was a typed note, shipment 1.5 tons gold coins. Temporary storage pending relocation. Jack sat back on his heels, breath clouding in the cold air. 1.5 tons of gold. That wasn't farm equipment. That wasn't something a small-town greenhouse was supposed to be built over. His hands shook slightly as he read the rest. The document listed coordinates that matched the county, dated August 1945, 3 months after the war ended. There were signatures at the bottom, names blacked out by age or intentional smudging. He flipped through the bundle, finding letters, receipts, and one brittle photograph. A younger version of his father standing beside a military truck, the same greenhouse visible in the distance behind him, still new, unburned the words, "Property of U.S. Army," faint on the crates stacked at his feet. "Dad, what were you guarding?" Jack whispered. The sound of his own voice startled him. He looked up, but only Scout's steady breathing answered. The dog nudged his hand gently, eyes fixed on the pipe still half buried in the soil. Jack brushed more dirt away and noticed a second marking, barely visible under the rust, S7, the same code from the document. He ran his thumb across it, a chill crawling up his spine. His father hadn't just stumbled onto government materials, he'd been keeping them. Protecting them, maybe. Scout barked suddenly, facing the broken window. Jack froze, scanning the orchard. The air was still too still. He grabbed the documents, stuffed them into his jacket, and covered the pipe with dirt again. Whatever this was, it was never meant to be found. He looked at Scout, whose ears were pinned body tense. "We're not done," Jack said quietly. "Not by a long shot." The wind swept through the orchard, carrying with it a faint metallic scent that didn't belong to nature. Jack turned toward the trees, his hand resting on the shovel, eyes narrowing as if the soil itself was watching. The night settled heavy around the Turner property, draping the orchard in long shadows. Jack sat at the kitchen table, the metal tube and its papers spread before him like a crime scene. The documents from 1945 were brittle, their ink ghosting into the paper, but the details were undeniable. His father hadn't just been a farmer. He'd been a custodian of something much larger. Scout lay beside the stove, eyes half open, ears twitching at every sound. Jack reached for the worn leather folder he had found in a cabinet earlier, the one with his father's initials etched faintly on the spine. Inside were old building permits receipts and the original blueprints for the greenhouse drawn in pencil and faded ink. The date in the corner read 1968. Turner Agricultural Development Project. He spread the large sheet across the table, flattening its creases. The design looked simple enough. Steel beams, ventilation systems, irrigation lines, but as he traced the structure with his finger, he noticed something odd. A faint rectangular marking under the floor plan, smaller, almost hidden between grid lines. The label beside it read, "Sublevel access for storage only." Jack frowned. His father had never mentioned a basement. He flipped the blueprint over. On the back, in faint pencil lines, was another sketch, cruder hand-drawn, as if meant to be erased. It showed a series of steps descending from the southeast corner of the greenhouse into a chamber labeled only as S7, the same code from the documents. Jack's breath hitched. He turned toward the window where the night pressed against the glass. "You kept it here," he whispered. "All this time." He felt Scout stir beside him, tail thumping softly on the floor. "You ready to find it, boy?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost reverent. The dog stood stretched and followed as Jack grabbed a flashlight and headed for the greenhouse. Inside, the air was colder than before, the kind of cold that came from beneath, not from the wind. Scout sniffed along the southern wall, nose tracing a line across the concrete foundation. Then he stopped, pawed at one section of the wall, and barked once sharp. Jack knelt beside him, brushing his hand across the surface. His fingers caught on a thin seam barely visible beneath years of grime, a small square plate welded shut. "Good work," he murmured. He fetched a crowbar from his toolbox and pried gently along the edges. The metal resisted, shrieking softly, then finally gave way. The plate clattered to the floor, revealing a narrow vent opening. A rush of cold air poured out, carrying with it a metallic tang, old and dense. Jack leaned closer, shining the flashlight inside. The beam cut through dust motes, revealing a shaft descending into darkness. His pulse quickened. Ventilation duct. Maybe, he muttered, though he knew it wasn't. His father's blueprint hadn't shown any vent there, only the sub-level access. Scout's nose twitched, a low growl humming in his throat. Jack felt a chill slide down his spine. He reached into the opening and brushed the interior with his glove. Smooth steel lined the walls, the kind used for sealed storage. He angled the flashlight further down and caught the glint of something metallic, a stair railing. The steps descended into shadow, perfectly preserved. His breath caught. He ran his hand along the frame of the opening, noticing faint scratches etched into the steel. It wasn't random wear, it was deliberate rhythmic. His chest tightened as recognition dawned. Morse code. His father had taught it to him when he was a boy, tapping messages on the side of his bedpost. Jack traced the grooves with his fingers, translating automatically. Then the words formed in his mind. Truth sleeps where fire once lived. He pulled back the flashlight, trembling in his hand. That phrase, his father's handwriting, the Morse, it was a message meant for him. The fire, the foundation, the years of silence, it all pointed here. Scout barked again, tail, rigid eyes fixed on the darkness below. The air that rose from the vent carried a smell rust oil, and something else faint but distinct. Jack wiped the sweat from his brow, despite the cold. He crouched at the edge of the opening, shining the beam deeper, but the light could only reach so far before the shadows swallowed it whole. The stairway seemed endless, the metal glinting faintly with frost. Behind him, the orchard creaked under the wind, the same sound it made the night of the fire. He looked at Scout, who stared down into the hole without flinching, then back at the blueprints folded in his jacket pocket. The words, "Sub-level, access for storage only," pulsed in his mind. He exhaled slowly, the weight of revelation settling over him. Whatever lay beneath the ashes of his father's greenhouse hadn't been destroyed in that fire, it had been hidden. And now, after 20 years, it was calling him back. The wind carried a strange stillness that night, the kind that made every leaf sound like a whisper. Jack couldn't sleep. The image of the stairway beneath the vent burned behind his eyes, each step a question his father never answered. He sat by the kitchen window, the blueprints folded neatly beside him, the Morse message repeating in his mind. Truth sleeps where fire once lived. Scout lay near the door, head resting on his paws, ears flicking every few seconds. Outside, the orchard stood motionless under a pale moon. Then Scout's head snapped up. A growl rolled from his chest, low and warning. Jack froze, eyes narrowing. The growl deepened, rising until it broke into a sharp bark that cut through the quiet like a gunshot. Jack grabbed his flashlight and the old crowbar heart kicking into rhythm. "What is it, boy?" he whispered, but Scout was already on his feet, pacing towards the back door, fur bristled along his spine. Jack cracked the door open. The cold hit him like a slap. Somewhere, near the greenhouse, a metallic clink echoed. Steady, deliberate, the sound of metal striking earth. He killed the light and crouched, moving through the shadows. Scout padding silently ahead. He heard shovels digging. He rounded the corner of the greenhouse and froze. Two men in dark jackets and masks were crouched near the southern wall, digging furiously. A lantern sat beside them, its glow painting their faces in ghostly yellow. "Faster," one hissed, his voice sharp. "He's bound to find it." The other grunted, lifting another scoop of soil. The light caught the edge of something metallic between them, Jack's father's nameplate from one of the foundation beams. His chest tightened. "Hey!" Jack's voice broke the air like thunder. The men jerked upright, startled. One reached for the lantern, the other for his pocket, but Scout was faster. The shepherd lunged forward, barking so fiercely the lantern toppled its glass, shattering against the dirt. Flames flickered for a second before dying under Scout's paws. The men bolted, vanishing toward the orchard. Jack sprinted after them but stopped as he saw a dark object lying in the pit they'd left, a two-way radio still crackling. He picked it up, pressed it to his ear. A man's voice came through, calm and measured, unmistakably authoritative. "Status report. Mayor says clear the site before sunrise." Jack's blood ran cold. The mayor, Hollis, his hands tightened around the radio. Static buzzed, followed by a new voice, one of the men he'd just chased. "We were interrupted. He's awake," the first voice snapped back. "Then finish it. No witnesses." Jack dropped the radio into his jacket and hurried back to the house, adrenaline surging through him. Scout followed close eyes darting toward the dark rows of trees. Inside, Jack locked the doors and pulled the curtains tight. He set the radio on the counter, its red light still blinking, and stared at it for a long moment. The mayor wanted the site cleared. He wanted the ground silent. Jack reached for the phone, dialed the sheriff's office. After a few rings, a weary voice answered. Flathead Sheriff's Department. "This is Jack Turner," he said, trying to steady his voice. "I just caught 2 men digging on my property. They were armed and had radio contact with Mayor Hollis. You need to send someone now." A pause. The voice on the other end shifted suddenly colder. "Mr. Turner," the sheriff said slowly, "Mayor Hollis is coordinating a land survey tonight. You're probably just seeing his contractors. I'd advise you not to interfere." Jack blinked, stunned. "Contractors? They tried to set fire to my property last week. I'm sure it's all a misunderstanding," the sheriff replied, voice firm. "Let the mayor handle it. He's authorized. Do not get involved." The line went dead. Jack stared at the phone, the silence roaring in his ears. Scout nudged his leg, sensing the shift in tension. "We're on our own," Jack murmured. He grabbed the flashlight again, scanning the corners of the room, his instinct sharpening into soldier mode. Something didn't feel right. Something inside the house. Scout was sniffing near the table, pawing at the floor. Then his nose moved toward the counter to the collar lying there from when Jack had removed his tags earlier that day. The dog growled softly, and Jack frowned. "What is it?" He picked up the collar and turned it over. Under the leather strap, a small metallic bump glinted beneath the tag. He pried it loose with his knife. It popped free a micro-GPS tracker no larger than a coin, blinking faintly green. Someone had been tracking Scout, which meant they had been tracking him. He turned to the device in his palm, realization hitting like a blow. Hollis hadn't just sent men to dig, he'd been watching every move since Jack set foot back in town. He looked down at Scout, whose eyes gleamed in the dim light, calm but ready. "They're not getting it," Jack whispered. "Not without going through us." Scout tilted his head, low rumble building. Outside, the wind howled across the orchard, bending the dead trees like silhouettes bowing to something unseen. Jack set the GPS tracker on the table and crushed it under the crowbar, the sound echoing through the house. He didn't flinch. His father had hidden the truth beneath this soil, and now others were willing to kill to bury it again. Somewhere in the dark, Hollis's men were regrouping, and the night was far from over. The next morning rose gray and cold, a colorless dawn pressing through the fog like breath on glass. Jack hadn't slept at all. The images of the 2 masked men, the radio transmission, and the blinking GPS beacon still burned in his mind. Hollis wasn't just corrupt, he was desperate. That kind of desperation meant one thing: whatever was hidden beneath the greenhouse was worth more than any man's conscience. Jack stood by the southern wall where Scout had found the vent, his breath visible in the chill. The air that came from below was colder now, heavier, like the vault itself was breathing. Scout stood beside him, tail stiff, ears forward, gaze fixed on the steel seam. "All right, boy," Jack whispered, voice calm but tight. "We're doing this before they come back." He dragged the oxygen tank and the cutting torch from the shed tools left from his days in the Corps, when improvisation meant survival. He adjusted the flame until it roared blue-white and pressed it against the edge of the sealed hatch. Sparks flew biting into the concrete floor. The air filled with the acrid scent of burnt metal, the hiss of gas. Scout paced behind him, restless, every muscle taut. The final weld gave way with a screech. Jack shut off the flame and pried the panel loose with the crowbar. The moment it dropped, a rush of stale, icy air rose from the darkness below, carrying the scent of dust oil and something metallic that didn't belong to time. Jack shone his flashlight down. The stairway stretched into a narrow tunnel lined with steel and brick, perfectly intact despite the years. "Let's see what you've been hiding," he muttered. Scout stepped to the edge, nose twitching, then began descending, first his paws clicking softly on the steps. Jack followed flashlight beam cutting across the walls. Every sound seemed amplified: the creak of his boots, the echo of dripping water somewhere deeper. The air grew colder with each step. When they reached the bottom, the tunnel opened into a large chamber roughly the size of a barn, its walls reinforced with riveted steel. The light caught on shapes rectangular shadows stacked neatly in rows. Jack approached one, his breath catching, when the beam revealed a crate marked with faded stenciling, U.S. Treasury, 1945 transfer. His pulse quickened. The wood was dark with age, sealed at the edges with wax. He brushed off the dust and found a serial number, then another, then another. 20 crates in total, all identical. He stepped back slowly, his mind racing. "Vault S7, he whispered. "It's real." Scout's nails clicked on the concrete as he moved among the boxes, sniffing, circling one particular crate near the far corner. Jack knelt beside him, running his hand along the seam. "You think this is it, huh?" The dog barked once sharp and sure. Jack grabbed a crowbar from his belt and wedged it under the lid. The nails protested, creaking, then gave way. As the seal broke, a faint metallic scent filled the air, followed by a gleam that made Jack's stomach drop. The flashlight's beam struck gold rows upon rows of it. Gold coins, gold bars, each stamped with the U.S. Eagle, and dated 1945. The light bounced off the gold, bathing the vault in a dull glow. Scout barked, the sound echoing off the metal, his fur lit by the golden reflection. Jack couldn't move for a moment. He just stared, the enormity of it sinking in. "1.5 tons, he murmured. "It's all here." He lifted one of the bars, feeling its impossible weight in his hands. The stamp read, "Fort Knox issue, 1945 transfer." His father hadn't been guarding junk. He had been safeguarding a shipment of government gold, about 1.5 tons of it worth nearly $90 million by today's standards. Jack's breath came slow and shallow. "Dad, what were you into?" he whispered. Scout barked again, this time toward the far end of the chamber, where a second door stood sealed in rust. Jack moved closer, sweeping his light over the surface. Scratched faintly into the metal were words barely legible, "For safekeeping until it's time to rebuild." His throat tightened. Those were his father's words, the same handwriting he'd seen on the blueprint notes years ago. He knew someone would come back. Jack said softly. Maybe he meant me. He turned to look at the crates again. The gold shimmered like sunlight trapped underground, each reflection throwing back fragments of history. For years, the town had called his father a recluse, a man who had lost everything in a fire. But now Jack saw the truth. His father had been protecting this, hiding it from men like Hollis. The sound of metal shifting behind him broke his trance. Scout's ears shot up. Jack swung the flashlight around, heart-hammering. A faint echo came from the stairway, footsteps distant but real. Someone else was here. He killed the light, plunging the vault into darkness, and placed a hand on Scout's back to steady him. The dog didn't bark, but a low growl vibrated through his chest. Above them, the faint clatter of boots on metal echoed down the shaft, followed by a voice low and muffled, speaking into a radio. Jack's pulse quickened. Hollis's men had returned, and now they were closer than ever. Morning light spilled weakly across the orchard, but to Jack it felt like interrogation lamps. The air was sharp, carrying the scent of diesel and distant sirens. Scout paced restlessly by the porch, hackles raised, sensing the tension before Jack even stepped outside. The first sound was tires on gravel, heavy vehicles, more than one. Jack's stomach tightened. Within minutes, the front drive filled with black SUVs and a state task force van, their doors flying open in choreographed motion. Men in suits, some in uniform, fanned out across the property. In front, walking with the calm precision of a man who had already rehearsed the scene, was Mayor Ray Hollis. His gray coat gleamed. His smile looked carved in stone. "Jack Turner," he called, his voice carrying over the engines. "Step forward, please." Jack did, hands raised, slightly confusion and anger warring on his face. "What is this?" he asked. "You sent men to dig on my property. You've been watching me for weeks. What are you doing here with federal property?" Mr. Turner Hollis interrupted smoothly, gesturing towards the greenhouse. "A hidden vault of U.S. Treasury gold discovered under unauthorized excavation." You've been in possession of classified materials and government assets. We have witnesses and a signed affidavit from the county prosecutor's office." Jack's jaw clenched. "That's not true. You know damn well I didn't steal anything. That gold was hidden by your father." Hollis cut in again, his tone softening for the crowd that had gathered near the gate. A tragic story, truly. A man trying to rebuild only for his son to repeat the same mistakes. Cameras flashed. A news van had pulled up, reporters shouting questions before the agents even moved. Is it true the veteran found the missing World War II gold? One voice called. Another shouted, was he working alone? Hollis turned to the cameras with practiced empathy. "Let's not forget," he said smoothly, "that theft of government property, regardless of intent, is still theft. We honor Mr. Turner's service, but the law must prevail." The agents moved in, pulling Jack's arms behind him, snapping cold handcuffs around his wrists. "This is a setup," Jack barked, struggling against their grip. "You planted this." One of the officers read him his rights, while another collected the crates from the vault. The flashbulbs kept exploding. Scout barked wildly, lunging at the nearest agent until one of them tried to grab his collar. "Don't touch him," Jack shouted, but they ignored him. In the chaos, Scout twisted free, his strength catching everyone off guard. The shepherd bolted toward Hollis, teeth bared, and leapt, grabbing the mayor's sleeve and yanking hard. Hollis stumbled, cursing under his breath as something small and metallic flew from his coat pocket and clattered across the dirt. One of the agents shouted, "Control that dog." Jack froze mid-struggle, his eyes locked on the object that had fallen. A key, long, brass, old-fashioned, engraved faintly near the handle with two characters S7. His breath hitched. The same code from the vault, the same mark on his father's documents. Hollis's face shifted for just a fraction of a second, fear recognition, then fury as he stooped to snatch the key off the ground. "I'll handle this," he snapped, waving off the agents. His voice regained its calm veneer as he turned to the cameras. "Aggressive animal," he said with a forced laugh, straightening his sleeve. "No harm done." But Jack had seen it, the mark, the guilt flickering behind Hollis's mask. Scout stood between them now, growling low amber eyes, locked on the mayor as though he could smell the lie. "You had that key," Jack said quietly, his voice breaking through the noise. "You knew about the vault before anyone did." Hollis's expression hardened, but only for an instant. "I'm not going to debate with a man under arrest," he said coldly. "Get him in the vehicle." Jack tried to speak again, but two agents forced him toward the van. The cameras swarmed closer, microphones thrust through the open door as the headline began writing itself before his eyes. By the end of the day, the local stations would air it on repeat. Veteran steals National Gold investigation underway. Jack sat in the van, wrists, aching, heart pounding with disbelief. He looked out through the window just long enough to see Scout still standing in the yard, tail high, watching as the vehicles began to roll away. Hollis turned to speak with an officer, tucking the key back into his pocket, his face once again the portrait of control. Jack's stomach twisted. He had the proof, but no one would believe him now. The cameras had already turned him into a villain. The air inside the van was stifling, every breath heavier than the last. He looked down at his hands, calloused, scarred, trembling with fury, and whispered to himself, "He knows. He's been in it since the beginning." The engine roared to life. The convoy started moving, tires crunching over frost and gravel. Scout barked once, sharp and defiant, the sound echoing long after the gates closed behind them. The holding cell smelled of disinfectant and metal fatigue. Jack sat on the narrow bench, elbows on his knees, eyes unfocused. Hours had passed since the arrest, and yet time seemed to move only when someone came to tell him what had been taken away next. The news had already aired 3 times, each headline sharper than the last "Veteran Steals National Gold." Hollis had made sure the narrative was airtight. The vault was now federal property. The gold had been seized, and Scout, his one steady companion, had been labeled a safety concern and taken away for quarantine observation. Jack had fought that decision harder than the cuffs, but the agents had already loaded Scout into a transport cage before he could even stand. The sound of the latch locking still echoed in his head. He rubbed his wrists, staring at the gray wall. The world thought he was a thief, but he had learned long ago that truth and evidence weren't always the same thing. He leaned back and closed his eyes. "Come on, boy," he whispered. "Prove them wrong." 50 miles away, Scout lay in a kennel at the Flathead Animal Control Center, restless, pacing tight circles around the small space. Per the county's standing arrangement, the Flathead Animal Control Center outsourced quarantine intakes to the same veterinary clinic where Liam worked that week. The staff had written "aggressive" in red marker on his chart, but the old shepherd was silent now, alert waiting. Beneath the worn leather of his collar, a small camera the size of a coin hummed faintly. Jack had built it himself years earlier using parts from his service days, a field reconnaissance chip motion-activated, linked to a transmitter hidden in the metal clasp. It wasn't for spying. It was for memory, a habit of documenting field work that had followed him home. The device had a safety protocol Jack had never needed to use. If Scout ever strayed more than 50 meters from him, it would automatically upload the last hour of footage to a whitelist of backup emails Jack had set his own and the clinic's general inbox. That upload was happening now, silently, packet by packet, bouncing through a cloud server before landing in the inbox of a man who didn't yet know what he had received. At the veterinary clinic across town, Liam Moore, a college student doing part-time work, sat at the reception desk, scrolling through emails while waiting for the next client. He was bored until a notification pinged an incoming message with a subject line that made no sense: Scout Cam, auto upload active transmission. The sender was an old encrypted address under the name JT Engineer. He frowned. The video attachment was already downloading. Curiosity overrode caution. He clicked play. The image was shaky, at first dark shapes muffled sound, but then it steadied, and Liam realized what he was seeing. The angle was low, ground level, like the perspective of a dog. The timestamp matched the night before. Scout's panting filled the mic as he followed Jack into the greenhouse. Sparks flew, a blue flame cutting metal, the faint hum of machinery. The light from Jack's torch illuminated his face, tired but determined, as he pried open the sealed hatch. The camera caught the first glimpse of the stairwell, then the descent into darkness. Liam leaned forward, transfixed. The light burst against gold, shimmering in the beam. Scout barked once the sound echoing through the chamber. Jack's voice came faintly, 1.5 tons, every ounce of it. For a moment, the recording seemed to flicker, the brightness overwhelming the lens. Then movement, footsteps on metal. Another figure appeared in the doorway, outlined by the stairwell light. Liam froze as the camera adjusted focus. The man stepping into the vault wasn't a federal agent. It was Mayor Hollis. He spoke sharply, voice clear enough to carry, "Get it cleared tonight. Make it look like another fire if anyone finds it." The sound bounced off the steel walls, distinct, undeniable. Then Hollis turned toward Jack, who looked up in shock. The rest of the conversation was fragmented. Jack shouting, Scout barking, but those words were enough. The video cut abruptly, ending with the sound of boots retreating and the vault door slamming shut. Liam sat back, heart racing. He replayed the last 10 seconds twice, then 3 times. There was no mistaking it. The footage was real time-stamped, geotagged, recorded by the dog's collar, and the mayor had just confessed on camera to staging fires and hiding evidence. Liam hesitated only a moment before forwarding the video. He opened his contacts and found one name he thought might listen: Evelyn Moore, his aunt, a journalist with the Flathead Post. She had written an opinion piece 2 days earlier mocking Jack Turner as a war vet lost in delusion. She'd laughed about it over dinner. Now he attached the file and typed quickly, "Aunt Ev, you need to see this. It's from the dog." Half an hour later, in a small apartment above the newsroom, Evelyn opened her laptop with mild annoyance. Her nephew's message blinked at the top of her inbox. She almost deleted it, but something about the subject line, Scout Cam footage, caught her eye. She clicked. The screen went black for a moment, then flickered to life. The footage unfolded quietly, the perspective odd, intimate, like watching through the eyes of truth itself. She watched Jack cutting the metal, the glow of fire, the gold shimmering in piles. Then Hollis appeared, his voice cold and casual as he said, "Make it look like another fire if anyone finds it. Evelyn's hand froze on the mouse. The color drained from her face, and she leaned closer, whispering to herself, "Oh my God, he was telling the truth." The newsroom clock ticked loud in the silence. She replayed the clip, then saved a copy onto a secure drive. Outside, the snow had started to fall again, coating the streets in quiet white. Evelyn stood grabbing her coat and phone. For the first time since she had written that story, she felt ashamed and afraid. Somewhere in a holding cell, a man sat branded a criminal, while the real one stood behind a mayor's desk. She whispered into the cold air, "Hang on, Jack. Someone's finally listening." The newsroom was still when Evelyn hit send. The email containing the video footage from Scout's collar shot through secure servers toward an FBI field office in Helena, Montana. Her hands trembled as she watched the upload bar complete, then leaned back in her chair, listening to the faint hum of the building. Outside, the snow continued to fall, the town below unaware that its most respected man had just been exposed. Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment, whispering a quiet apology to the man she'd mocked in print. "He was right all along," she murmured. By dawn, the video had reached the FBI's Cyber Forensics Division. Analysts gathered around monitors as the footage looped again and again. They ran digital integrity scans, hash verification, compression analysis, timecode verification, and every result came back identical. The file was untouched, no edits, no splices, no manipulation. The camera's metadata confirmed GPS coordinates matching the Turner greenhouse within a margin of 2 meters. The timestamp showed the footage had been captured 3 hours before the police raid Hollis had orchestrated. That meant when Hollis appeared in the video ordering a cover-up, he had already known about the vault. And when the raid occurred, he wasn't discovering it, he was reclaiming it. The truth was plain as daylight. Within hours, agents in black SUVs surrounded the mayor's home. Hollis, still in his robe, opened the door with feigned surprise. "Is this some sort of misunderstanding?" he asked, his politician's smile flickering. The lead agent handed him a warrant. "Federal investigation. Step aside, sir." His voice was steady, his eyes cold. Hollis's composure cracked just slightly as agents entered methodically, searching every room. Evelyn's footage had triggered a formal inquiry into misappropriation of federal property, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit arson. They left no shelf unchecked. In the study behind a cabinet panel, an agent pried open a hidden compartment. Inside lay a Colt .45 pistol, its barrel worn, but oiled its serial number partially filed off. The agent held it up under the light. "Bag it," he ordered. Forensics later confirmed the ballistic matched the bullet fragments recovered from the burned foundation of the Turner greenhouse in 1997, matched rounds fired from that very weapon. One shard had been heat-sealed into a tar drip on the load-bearing beam, preserving rifling marks despite the fire. The fire that had killed Jack's father, Grant Turner, had not been an accident. It had been a murder, and Hollis's own gun had told the story. The arrest was quiet but final. Hollis was led out in handcuffs as the cameras rolled, the same cameras he had once called to witness Jack's humiliation. This time, no smile touched his face. Evelyn watched the footage stream live from the courthouse steps. She stood in the cold with her notebook trembling in her hands, tears stinging her eyes. The headline, scrolling across the screen, read, "Mayor charged in 1945 Gold Conspiracy Veteran's name cleared." Weeks later, the courtroom was full. Journalists lined the benches. Federal officers stood near the door, and Jack sat at the defendant's table, no longer in chains. His posture was straight, his expression unreadable. The prosecutor presented the sequence of evidence with surgical precision: the Scout video, the ballistic report, the financial records connecting Hollis to shell accounts labeled S7 Holdings. Every thread led back to the same man. The defense's arguments unraveled before they began. When Hollis finally took the stand, his voice was hoarse, his confidence long gone. "Grant wouldn't give me the gold." He rasped the words, barely reaching the microphone. He said it belonged to rebuilding the town, to the veterans coming home. I tried to reason with him, but he wouldn't listen. He paused, his hands trembling. I had to burn it all. I thought the fire would erase it. The courtroom fell silent. Cameras clicked in the stillness. Hollis looked up, eyes hollow as though decades of lies had finally collapsed under their own weight. Jack said nothing. He reached into his jacket pocket and unfolded a scorched piece of paper, the same note he had found among his father's things, edges blackened but the handwriting still clear. He placed it gently on the table before him. The judge leaned forward to read. If they call it greed, remind them it was meant to rebuild. The room stayed quiet until the judge met Jack's eyes. "Mr. Turner," she said softly, "on behalf of this court and this community, I extend my apologies. You were wronged by power, by circumstance, by history itself." She lifted her gavel. "Case dismissed. All charges against Jack Turner are hereby dropped. His record is cleared." The gavel struck wood sharp and final, echoing through the hall like the closing of a long haunted chapter. Evelyn exhaled from the gallery, tears glinting under the courtroom lights. She looked at Jack, who sat motionless for a moment before running a hand over his face. Scout, seated obediently by his feet, lifted his head and wagged his tail once the soft thump breaking the tension. Cameras flashed again, but this time they captured something different, relief, not shame. Truth had burned twice on that land, but now finally the fire was out. A year can change the shape of everything. The Turner orchard no longer looked like a graveyard of burnt trees and silence. The air smelled of damp soil and jasmine. Where the scorched greenhouse once stood, a new structure rose in its place, taller, stronger, the glass panes gleaming under the morning sun like facets of gold. The sign over the entrance read, "Turner Center for Veterans Renewal." Inside, sunlight poured through the glass roof, landing on rows of green that reached toward the light herbs, fruit trees, and vegetables grown by hands that had once carried rifles instead of seeds. Veterans moved slowly among them, shoulders relaxing, eyes softening. Some talked quietly, some worked in silence, but all of them carried the same look, the expression of men and women learning finally how to breathe again. Jack stood near the entrance, his jacket sleeves rolled a faint trace of soil under his nails. His posture was lighter now, no longer weighed by ghosts. He watched a young veteran carefully transplant a sapling and offer it water, as if every drop was a small act of forgiveness. Scout lay a few feet away, stretched on the warm concrete, his fur now grayer than gold. His ears still perked at the sound of laughter, though his legs didn't move as fast anymore. "Not bad, huh?" Jack said softly, looking down at him. "Guess we really did rebuild it." The dog blinked, tail thumping once against the floor. The world had moved forward since the trial. The government had formally recognized the recovered treasure as part of a lost post-war Reconstruction Fund assets that had never reached the veterans it was meant for. Of the roughly $90 million in recovered gold, about 1.5 tons unearthed beneath the greenhouse, 80% had been transferred to the National Veterans Support Fund, ensuring grants for housing therapy and education for those who served. The remaining 20%, by court decree and family trust, was dedicated to the creation of this center in memory of Grant Turner. The story had made national news not for its scandal anymore, but for what had come after. Headlines now read, "Veteran Clears Father's Name Turns Gold into Growth." Evelyn Moore had written that piece herself. She stood near the entrance, today camera crew in tow, watching as Jack adjusted a bronze plaque freshly mounted beside the greenhouse doors. The engraved words caught the sunlight as he polished them with a cloth. He rebuilt what they tried to burn and planted what they tried to bury. Evelyn's throat tightened as she read it aloud. "That's beautiful," she said quietly. Jack smiled faintly, tightening the final screw. "My father would have liked it simple," he replied. "He always said the truth doesn't need to shout, it just needs to stand." Children from the local school toured the greenhouse that afternoon, their laughter echoing between the glass walls. One of them, a boy no older than 10, stopped beside Scout and knelt gently, stroking the shepherd's head. "He's the dog that found the gold, right?" he asked with wide eyes. Jack crouched beside him, smiling. "Yeah," he said softly, "but he found something even more important than that." The boy tilted his head. "What's that?" Jack looked down at Scout, whose eyes were half closed under the warmth of the light. "Honor," he said simply. "He found our honor." As the sun began to set, golden rays filtered through the panes, scattering across the plants like coins spilled from heaven. The greenhouse glowed not with wealth, but with renewal. Veterans gathered in small groups talking quietly as the day ended, the air thick with the scent of basil and hope. Jack walked to the center of the room where the original foundation stone of the old greenhouse had been preserved beneath a clear floor panel. Beneath it, faint scorch marks from the 1997 fire were still visible, framed like an artifact of memory. He knelt there for a moment, resting a hand against the glass. "You kept it safe, Dad," he murmured, "even when the world forgot." Scout stirred beside him, letting out a small sigh as he lay under the fading sunlight. His breathing was slower these days, steady but thin, as if each breath carried a lifetime of loyalty. Jack reached out and ran a hand through the thick fur along his neck. "You didn't just find Gold Boy," he said, voice breaking into a whisper. "You found everything we lost." The dog's tail moved faintly, his eyes half closed in peace. Outside, wind brushed through the orchard, and the last of the light fell in soft amber stripes across the floor. Cameras rolled one last time for the dedication ceremony. As the mayor's replacement gave a short speech about courage and rebuilding, Jack's gaze drifted upward. The sunlight filtered through the glass, catching the dust in the air until it shimmered like powdered gold. The reflection danced over the leaves and onto the walls, turning everything it touched into a soft golden hue. For a fleeting moment, it looked as if the greenhouse itself was alive again, breathing, healing, remembering. The crowd's applause rose around him, but Jack barely heard it. His hand stayed on Scout's fur, warm beneath the light. The camera pulled back, framing the greenhouse in full, the new glass gleaming the orchard stretching beyond it, the sun settling low and slow over Montana hills. The light bent through the panels, scattering across the plants like melted metal. The gold that had once been buried in secrecy now lived as sunlight reflected in every leaf and window pane. The truth, once hidden under ashes, had become illumination, and as the day faded, the Turner greenhouse stood not as a monument to greed, but to redemption. It lived, rebuilt, reborn, and shining quietly with the color of forgiveness. If this story touched you, please like and subscribe to follow more real soul-stirring tales like this one. What moment hit you hardest, the gold beneath the soil or the truth it uncovered? Tell me where you're watching from, I'd love to know.